Mr. Noisy was a very Mr. Noisy person indeed. For example, if Mr. Noisy was reading this, he'd be shouting at the top of his voice. And the top of Mr. Noisy's voice is a very loud place indeed. You can hear it 100 miles away. For example, when most people sneeze, you can hear them in the next room. But you can hear them in the next country. Now, this story starts when Mr. Noisy was asleep in bed. In his bedroom, at his house. He was snoring. And as you can well imagine, when Mr. Noisy snores, that is a snore worth hearing. It sounds more like a herd of elephants than a snore. Then Mr. Noisy walked down the hill. He walked into the baker's shop.
I'd like a piece of meat,
boomed Mr. Noisy to Mrs. Crumb, the baker's wife. Mrs. Crumb trembled and sold him.
Piece of meat.
Then Mr. Noisy walked along the street to the butcher. He walked into the butcher's shop.
I'd like...
Whisper, boomed Mr. Noisy to Mr. Bacon, the butcher. Mr. Bacon trembled and sold him. Whisper. Afterwards, Mrs. Crumb met Mr. Bacon in the street. "We raise your nose and neighbours your nose, why we shoot somebody," she said. "Cried Mr. Bacon. "Oh, yeah," said Mrs. Crumb. And she whispered into Mr. Bacon's ear. Mr. Bacon smiled a small smile, which grew into a broad grin. "Mrs. Crumb," he said, "I think you've got the answer." The following day, Mr. Noisy again went shopping down to Wobbletown. He went into Mrs. Crumb's shop.
"I'd like a loaf of bread,"
boomed. I'm sorry. What did you say?" asked Mrs. Crumb, pretending not to hear.
Mr.
Mr. Noisy shouted. "Oh, I'm sorry," said Mrs. Crumb, putting her hand to her ear. Could you speak up a bit, please?"
"I'd like a loaf of loaf,"
roared Mr. Noisy. "I can't hear you," replied Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy gave up and went out. Mr. Noisy was making a
"I'd like steams."
boomed. Mr. Bacon pretended not to notice.
"I like this meat, I 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 like this meat."
He shouted. "Did you say something?" asked Mr. Bacon.
"I said, I like this meat, 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 I like this meat,"
roared Mr. Noisy. Said Mr. Bacon. Mr. Noisy gave up. The day after, Mr. Noisy tried again. He went into Mrs. Crumb's shop.
"I'd like a loaf of bread."
Boom. "A what?" asked Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy started shouting at the very top of his voice.
A, 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 lol.
Then he stopped. Then he thought. And then he said quietly,
"I'd like a loaf of bread."
Mrs. Crumb smiled.
"No!"
she said. Then Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop. "Did you say something?" asked Mr. Bacon.
I did,"
shouted Mr. Noisy at the very, very top of his voice.
A, 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 A.
Then he stopped. And then he thought. And then he said quietly, Mr. Bacon smiled. "Did you say something?" asked Mr. Bacon. So, carrying his bread and meat, Mr. Noisy set off home up the hill. And then he stopped. Then he thought. And then do you know what he did? He went into Mrs. Crumb's shop.
"I'd like..."
Whisper.
I'd like a piece of meat.